So for about a year now, my friend Mary has been asking me to make her a bowl. But she also really loves Disney. So I wanted to integrate those two things together into something really special for her. At the beginning, I decided I wanted to use black walnut and maple, a classic combination. So I went through my wood rack to find what I had on hand to start the bowl with. All of the lumber was fairly rough, so I had to go ahead and joint and face everything and cut it to manageable sizes. I had some really nice 8/4 black walnut slabs I bought from a local guy, so I resawed those into a couple of boards. I sawed up the maple board into 12 segments, and this would be part of the feature ring. So I used the CNC to cut these out. This was the easiest way to get a really nice accurate cut. And here you can see the size of the Mickey head silhouette that I decided to use on each segment. For the infill, instead of using wood, which was my original intention, I found that something like epoxy was going to be the best option. So I used some of this shelving board that has this Formica on it. It's fairly non-stick. And I clamped all the segments down to this board so that it would give me a good way to keep anything from leaking out of the bottom. Thanks to Peter Brown over at Shoptime, he gave me some good advice on using epoxy, since this is the first time I'd messed with it. So this is just a 2-part casting epoxy, and the instructions are pretty straightforward. Mix it really well. I tried using this color pigment as the way of tinting it to a really dark black, since I wanted it to have that really nice silhouette look for that classic Mickey head. And then I poured enough epoxy into each segment, and I found it shrunk a little bit on a test piece, so I overfilled a little bit, so it kind of looks messy. But the overfill ended up working out because as it shrunk a little bit, it kept it fairly level with the top of the segment. I actually let these cure for a couple of days because the epoxy stayed somewhat tacky after 24 hours. Once I pulled them off the board, I turned the face side down up, and I gave it a nice flat surface to put into my little segment cutting sled here. And by having that nice flat face, I knew that they were registered, so I would get a perfect cut. As I was cutting these, I decided to leave a little bit of it. I didn't get a complete cut across the whole side of the segment, and that left just a little flat space that when I turned the segment around, it would register against that stop block, and I knew that my cuts were in the exact same place on both sides of all 12 segments. I like to sand the edges, the cut edges, to get the little woolly boogers off the segments, and that keeps them from getting in the way of gluing it up. Get a nice tight glue line. I always like to lay out the segments first, just to make sure everything's going to line up correctly, and I'll have a nice tight glue line. Now it's time to glue up the feature ring segments. And you can never use enough glue, or you can never use too much glue when you're gluing these up. So a little bit extra doesn't hurt. I really like to use these large hose clamps to glue up these rings because you get a nice even pressure, a nice even clamping pressure all the way around the ring. And since they're metal, it's very hard for them to stick to any of the glue squeeze out. Even though I'll be turning this later, I always like to get the excess glue off. It's just less glue to have to knock off with the turning tools, and less wear on my carbide cutters. And once it's dry, take all the band clamps off, and our feature ring is ready to go. And to my surprise, it actually was fairly level and laid fairly flat to the table. So now I had to glue up the rest of the black walnut rings, and there will be several of these, all of varying sizes, that will come together and stack up to create the bottom of the bowl. I like to use the same band clamps to clamp all the regular rings as well. And these clamps are really great. You can get them, usually you can get them online from like an HVAC supply website. Sometimes you can take the smaller ones and put them together and make bigger ones if you need them to be bigger. You can customize them to the size that you need. After I take them out of the clamps, I always like to just kind of give them a good visual inspection, make sure there's no glaring problems like gaps or anything that was far off. So now I'll use my sanding disc on my lathe to flatten both sides of the rings, and this will give me a really nice tight glue up, really tight glue lines and joints between the rings, and no gaps. That's the big thing. I just don't want any gaps. After I sand all the rings, I'll do a test stack. Just stack everything up, make sure everything looks right, looks like it's going to fit correctly. Two of the rings I didn't show previously are these two upper and lower rings that go on the top and bottom of the feature ring. Once I'm happy with the stack, I'll go ahead and glue everything up. And again, this is a time where more glue is better, just to make sure you've got good even coverage and no gaps, because it's very hard to get glue in there later on after you've clamped this all up and allowed it to dry. I found it's very difficult to try to glue all these rings together at one time in a stack because they'll just slide around. So I like to glue up sub-assemblies. I'll do the feature ring and then some of the tapered rings, and that all comes together. Then I glue those sub-assemblies together afterwards. So for the bottom ring, it's really hard to get the segments to a point, all the points together. So the easiest thing to do is to actually drill out a known sized hole, and then I like to turn a plug with the same wood type and glue that in, and then I'll have a really nice bottom where the points coming together aren't an issue anymore because they're not there and it doesn't stick out. So now I'll unclamp all the sub-assemblies, and these will all get glued together into a single stack. And I'll usually let this dry overnight. So I put the whole assembly on the lathe with the coal jaws, and then I glue on a waste block, and I usually will cut this out 2x4 or 2x10 depending on the size of the bowl, and I use the tailstock to actually clamp it in place. Once it's dry, I'll turn that round so I'll know that that's round to the bowl and take it off the lathe. I switch the jaws on my chuck to dovetail jaws and go ahead and clamp that to the waste block that I just glued on, and then put it back on the lathe. At this point it can start turning. I'll start knocking down those corners of the rings down, and then getting a generally round shape to the bowl, and then I can increase the speed of the lathe. The more round I make it, the more I can increase the speed, and I get a nicer cut the faster I can run the lathe. And start working on the inside of the bowl. Now I was having some trouble with catching on the epoxy. The epoxy makes a mess. My hat's off to the other guys, Peter Brown and Matt Cremona and those who have done some epoxy turning. It was kind of a pain, but in the end it turned out pretty nice. So I used some mineral spirits to just clear off all the sawdust, and then came back with just regular old boiled linseed oil and did a coat of boiled linseed oil while it was still on the lathe. This project gave me a chance to use my coal jaw extensions that I'd made. These are just 1/2-inch plywood that I was able to machine fairly precisely to fit onto my coal jaws, and these gave me nice extensions to fit the bowl on. And this bowl was pretty much the maximum swing of my lathe. My lathe will allow me to do about a 12-inch swing, so this was maxed out. So I have it turned around now so I can turn the waste block off the bottom, and as I'm turning that off, I'm also working on finishing the bottom of the bowl, at least rough finishing it. Then I'll just saw that waste block off and clean up the bottom. And of course I finished off the bottom with a little more linseed oil so that the finish would match the rest of the bowl. I rubbed on one more coat of boiled linseed oil. I always try to do at least a couple of coats. It seems to make the wood just a little bit richer each time you add another coat. And there's the finished bowl, and I think Mary was pretty happy.
Oh, that turned out nice.
That's very nice. Thank you. That is gorgeous.
You're welcome.
Telling him I wanted a bowl and then he Jason, that came out great. Yes. You just look making me cry. Keep making me cry.
Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.